The autumn wind carried the scent of dust and dying grass across the vast Montana territory, sweeping through valleys and over ridges like an invisible river. Jacob Thornhill rode his chestnut mare slowly along the narrow mountain trail, his tall frame swaying gently with the horse's steady gait. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, scanned the horizon with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much and felt even more. At 34 years old, Jacob Thornhill was a man carved from hard living and harder losses. He'd spent the last decade working cattle ranches from the scorching plains of Texas to the bitter winters of Wyoming, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home, never letting himself put down roots that might grow into something he could lose again. His sun-weathered face, all sharp angles and weathered bronze skin, bore the deep lines of grief that 10 years hadn't managed to erase. Crow's feet fanned from the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting into harsh sunlight and harsher memories. His grey eyes held the kind of emptiness that came from losing everything that mattered. People said Jacob Thornhill was a man you could count on for hard work and honest dealing, but not for conversation or comfort. He kept to himself, spoke only when necessary, and never, ever talked about the past that haunted every step he took. The September afternoon was fading, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose gold, when he spotted the overturned wagon in the ravine below. Jacob's jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively moved toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. In this territory, abandoned wagons usually meant one thing, and it was never good. The frontier was littered with the broken dreams of those who'd headed west, seeking fortune, and found only hardship. He guided his mare carefully down the rocky slope, loose stones skittering beneath her hooves. The descent was steep, treacherous, but the horse was sure-footed and trusted his guidance. As they approached the wreckage, the silence felt wrong, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. No birds sang in the scrub brush, no insects buzzed in the dying grass, just the wind whispering through the sage, carrying secrets it would never tell. The wagon's canvas top was torn and weathered, flapping weakly in the breeze. The wood was sun-bleached and splintered, suggesting it had been there for days, maybe longer. One wheel had broken completely off, and the wagon had tipped sideways into the ravine, spilling its meager contents across the dusty earth. Jacob could see a trunk, its lid thrown open, clothes scattered like fallen leaves. A cooking pot, a water barrel, long since empty. Jacob dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, each step measured and cautious. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, an old instinct from years of living on the edge of danger. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the whistle of the wind, a whimper, soft and broken, like a wounded animal trying not to make noise. He moved around the wagon, his heart starting to pound with a dread he couldn't name, and stopped. Cold. A woman lay motionless on the ground, her simple calico dress torn and dusty, her blonde hair spread across the dirt like spun gold dulled by tragedy. Her face was turned toward the sky, peaceful in death, and even now, even like this, Jacob could see she'd been young, perhaps 25 at most. Her hands were rough, work-worn, the hands of a woman who knew what it meant to struggle. One shoe was missing. Her lips were cracked and pale, but it wasn't the woman that made Jacob's heart clench painfully in his chest, stealing his breath and making the world tilt sideways for just a moment. It was the small figure curled against her body, a tiny hand clutching the woman's sleeve with desperate dirt-stained fingers that wouldn't let go even in sleep. A little girl, no more than 4 years old. Maybe younger. She had tangled brown hair that hung in matted waves around her small face, and her dress, once probably white with tiny blue flowers, was now grey with dust and stained with things Jacob didn't want to think about. Her face was streaked with the tracks of dried tears, dozens of them, layer upon layer, like a map of her grief. When she heard his footsteps, her eyes opened. They were big and hazel, flecked with gold and green, and they looked up at him with a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and desperate hope that made something crack in the fortress Jacob had built around his heart 10 years ago. "Mama won't wake up," the child whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked from crying, from calling out to no one in the endless emptiness of the ravine. "I tried and tried, but she won't wake up." Her words hit Jacob like a physical blow, and he stood frozen for a long moment as memories flooded back with brutal, merciless force. Another time, another death, another little girl he couldn't save, his own daughter, Emma, barely 3 years old when the fever took her. Her mother, his beloved Catherine, had followed within 2 days, her body too weakened by caring for their sick child to fight off the same disease. He'd buried them both in a cold February ground, so frozen he'd had to build fires to thaw the earth enough to dig. He'd buried them together, mother and child, because he couldn't bear to separate them even in death. And he'd been running from that grave ever since, never staying in one place, never letting himself care about anything or anyone, because caring meant you had something to lose. And losing was a pain too deep to survive twice. But here, now, in this ravine in the middle of nowhere, was another little girl, another mother gone, another tragedy written in the dust and tears of the frontier. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing down the memories, and made himself move. He knelt slowly beside them, being careful not to startle the child. This close, he could see more details he'd missed from a distance. The woman had been dead for at least 2 days, maybe 3, judging by the pallor of her skin and the stillness of her body. Cholera, most likely, based on what he could see. The disease swept through wagon trains like wildfire, killing whole families in days. The miracle, the absolute miracle, was that the child had survived. She must have stayed here alone for days. No food, no water that he could see, just waiting for her mother to wake up, to come back to her, to make everything right again, the way mothers were supposed to do. "What's your name, little one?" Jacob asked, keeping his voice as soft and gentle as he could manage. It had been so long since he'd spoken tenderly to a child that his voice felt rusty, uncertain. The girl studied him with those enormous, haunted eyes, still clutching her mother's sleeve as if letting go would make the death real in a way she wasn't ready to accept. Her lower lip trembled. "Sarah," she whispered, so quietly he had to lean closer to hear. "Sarah May Harper." "Well, Sarah May, my name's Jacob." He hesitated, then slowly, carefully, reached out his hand, palm up, non-threatening. "I'm going to help you, but first, we need to let your mama rest, all right? She's awful tired and she needs to sleep for a while." It was a lie, of course, a gentle fiction to spare her the full horror of the truth, at least for now. But Sarah was 4 years old. She'd seen her mother die, had probably watched it happen, helpless and terrified. She deserved whatever small comfort a lie could provide. Sarah shook her head violently, her small fingers gripping tighter, turning white with the effort. "No! She'll wake up. She has to wake up. She always wakes up in the morning. Always." The anguish in her voice, the desperate denial, nearly broke him. Jacob had faced down outlaws with guns drawn, survived stampedes that could crush a man to nothing, weathered winters so brutal they killed cattle where they stood. He'd seen men shot, seen friends die, seen every kind of violence the frontier had to offer, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the raw, unfiltered grief in a child's eyes. Nothing had prepared him for the way his own heart, that dead thing in his chest he'd thought was beyond feeling, cracked wide open at the sound of her broken voice. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, each word careful, measured, "and I know you want your mama. I understand that more than you know. But I need you to be very brave right now. Can you be brave for me, Sarah May?" She looked at him with those huge hazel eyes, tears spilling over and making new tracks down her dirty cheeks. She looked from Jacob to her mother, then back again, searching his face for something. Honesty, maybe, or kindness, or just the smallest sign that the world wasn't entirely cruel and empty. Whatever she saw in his weathered face, in his sad grey eyes, must have convinced her, because after a long, trembling moment, she slowly loosened her grip on her mother's sleeve. Her small hand shook as she pulled it away, and fresh tears fell as she whispered, "I don't want to leave her alone." "I know, sweetheart." The endearment surprised him, slipping out before he could stop it. "I know you don't." Jacob carefully lifted the child into his arms, and the moment he did, he realized just how light she was, how thin. She couldn't have weighed more than 30 pounds, too light for a child her age. Evidence of the hard journey she and her mother had been on. Her small body trembled with exhaustion, dehydration and fear, shaking like a leaf in a storm. She immediately buried her face in his shoulder, her tiny fingers clutching his worn shirt with the same desperate grip she'd had on her mother. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, fast and fragile as a bird's, fluttering with panic and grief. The walk back to his horse felt like the longest of his life. Each step was weighted with the responsibility he'd just taken on, with the frightened child in his arms who had no one else in the world, who'd just lost everything. Sarah stayed silent against his chest, but he could feel her breathing, shallow and uneven, feel the dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. Her small hands gripped him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself cruel and unstable. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair, surprised by how natural the words felt, how right it seemed to comfort her. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." But before they could leave, before he could just ride away from this place of death and sorrow, Jacob knew he had a duty to fulfill. He couldn't bury the woman properly, not without tools, not without help, but he couldn't leave her exposed to scavengers either. No one deserved that, least of all a mother who'd fought so hard to protect her child. He set Sarah down gently on a flat rock near his horse, making sure she could see him at all times. The child watched with empty, hollowed-out eyes as Jacob gathered rocks from the ravine, large ones and small ones, and began covering the woman's body. It was hard work in the heat, and sweat ran down his back as he lifted stone after stone, creating a cairn that would protect her until someday someone could come back with proper supplies for a real burial. When he finished, Jacob stood over the grave for a moment, his hat in his hands, and said a prayer he hadn't spoken in 10 years. He didn't know if God was listening anymore, wasn't even sure he believed in a God who would let a mother and child suffer like this. But he said the words anyway, for Sarah, if not for himself. Then he went back to the child and knelt beside her. Sarah was staring at the cairn, her face blank with shock, and Jacob's heart ached for her. "Is there anyone else?" he asked gently. "Your papa, grandparents, aunts or uncles?" Sarah shook her head slowly, never taking her eyes from where her mother lay. "Papa went to heaven 2 winters ago," she whispered, her voice flat, emotionless, the way people sound when they've cried all the tears they have. "Mama said it was just us after that, just us 2. We were going to Oregon to find her sister, Aunt Margaret. Mama said Aunt Margaret would help us." Jacob's jaw tightened. A woman and child alone on the Oregon Trail. The desperation that must have driven them. The hope that must have kept them going even when the journey became impossible. And now this little girl had no one. Not her father, not her mother. Just an aunt in Oregon who would never know what happened to her sister and niece. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her. Dirty, exhausted, traumatized, and utterly, completely alone in the world. Every instinct, every bit of common sense he had told him to take her to the nearest town, find her some good family to take her in. There were plenty of couples who couldn't have children of their own, plenty of families who might take in an orphan out of Christian duty, if nothing else. But the nearest settlement was 3 days' ride, and winter was coming fast. The nights were already cold, and Sarah was weak, possibly sick herself. 3 days of hard riding might kill her, and something in those hazel eyes looking up at him with such fragile, desperate trust made him pause. Something in the way her small hand reached for his, the way she leaned toward him, like he was the only safe thing left in a dangerous world. "Sarah May," he said, carefully, weighing each word, "I live up in the mountains, about 3 hours from here. It's quiet and it's lonely, but it's safe and warm. I've got a cabin with a good stove and food and clean water. Would you like to come stay with me for a while, until we figure out what to do? Until you're stronger?" It was madness. He was a drifter, a man who could barely take care of himself, who couldn't even keep plants alive, much less care for a traumatized child. He didn't know the first thing about little girls, about what they needed, about how to fix what was broken in her heart. But the words were out before he could stop them, before he could talk himself out of this terrible, wonderful mistake. Sarah's eyes, those big hazel eyes, filled with fresh tears. Her small chin wobbled. "Don't want to be alone," she whispered, and it was the most heartbreaking thing Jacob had ever heard. "Then you won't be," Jacob heard himself say, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. "I promise you won't be alone." He lifted her onto his mare and climbed up behind her, his arms secure around her small, fragile frame. As they rode away from the ravine, away from the cairn of stones, and the broken wagon and the shattered dreams, Sarah leaned back against him. Within a few minutes, her eyelids grew heavy with the kind of exhaustion that came from days of terror and grief. Soon, she was asleep, her head resting against his chest with a trust that terrified him. Jacob Thornhill, who hadn't let anyone close in 10 years, who'd sworn on his wife and daughter's grave that he'd never again risk the pain of loss, looked down at the sleeping child in his arms and realized with a mixture of fear and wonder that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. The ride to his cabin took 3 hours, and Jacob used every minute of it to question what he'd done. What had he been thinking, taking in a child? He was a man who lived alone, who preferred it that way, who had nothing to offer a little girl who'd need tenderness and patience and all the things he'd buried with his family. But every time he considered turning the horse toward the settlement, toward sensible people who would know what to do, Sarah would shift in her sleep, her small hand clutching his shirt, and he couldn't bring himself to do it. She trusted him somehow, impossibly. This traumatized child, who'd lost everything, had looked into his eyes and decided he was safe. He couldn't betray that, wouldn't. Jacob's homestead sat in a narrow valley surrounded by pine-covered mountains, with a creek running cold and clear behind the log cabin he'd built with his own hands 2 years ago when he'd finally decided to stop running. The cabin wasn't much, just 4 rooms and a sleeping loft, but it was solid and warm and well-built. More permanent than anywhere he'd lived since losing his family. He'd built it thinking he might finally try to settle down, might finally stop running from ghosts. But even here, even in this place he'd made with his own hands, he'd remained alone, keeping the world at a distance. Sarah woke as they approached the cabin, blinking sleepily at the unfamiliar surroundings. Jacob felt her stiffen in his arms as reality crashed back over her, felt the moment when memory returned, and with it, the fresh wave of grief. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and soothing like he used with spooked horses. "We're here. You're safe. I've got you." He dismounted carefully, keeping Sarah secure in one arm while he grabbed his saddlebags with the other. The mare knew the way to the small barn and headed there without direction. Jacob carried Sarah to the cabin, pushed open the door with his shoulder, and stepped inside. The interior was sparse but clean. Jacob kept a tidy house, having learned during his wandering years that mess and disorder made a man feel worse than he already did. The main room held a stone fireplace, a worn settee he'd bought from a widow heading back east, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with the few books he owned. The kitchen area was in one corner, simple and functional. Through a doorway was a small bedroom he rarely used, preferring to sleep in the loft. Jacob set Sarah down gently on the settee. She looked impossibly small in the large room, like a doll someone had forgotten. Her eyes darted around nervously, taking in the unfamiliar space, the strange smells, the absolute otherness of everything. "Are you hungry?" Jacob asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sarah nodded slightly, though her expression suggested she might not have the strength to eat. She looked like a child who'd gone past hunger into the numbness that came after. Jacob moved to the kitchen area, acutely, painfully aware of how inadequate his supplies were for a child. He had beans, salt pork, cornmeal and coffee. He had dried beef and some canned vegetables he'd bought at the trading post. He had flour and sugar and molasses, all staples for a man living alone, none of it suitable for a sick, grieving 4-year-old. Finally, he settled on making a simple broth with some dried vegetables and a bit of the salt pork for flavor. While it simmered, he soaked some bread in warm milk and honey, making it soft and easy to swallow. When he brought it to her, Sarah took the bowl with both small hands and drank the broth slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned that food might not stay down. She managed a few bites of the bread before her hands started shaking, and Jacob gently took the bowl away. "That's good, sweetheart. That's enough for now. Your stomach needs time to remember how to eat." He found some of his own clothes, clothes, an old shirt that had been Catherine's favorite because it was soft from many washings. It would serve as a nightgown for Sarah, would drown her small frame, but at least be clean and warm. Jacob heated water on the stove and poured it into a basin. With a clean cloth, he gently washed Sarah's face and hands, removing the layers of dirt and dried tears. She sat silently through it all, her eyes watching him with that same mixture of fear and desperate hope, like she was waiting for him to change his mind, to decide she was too much trouble and leave her somewhere. "I'm going to put you to bed now," Jacob said when she was as clean as he could make her without a proper bath. "You need rest, real sleep in a real bed." He carried her up the narrow stairs to the loft where he slept. It was a simple space with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a chair in the corner where he sometimes sat and couldn't sleep. He tucked Sarah into the bed with every blanket he owned, making a warm nest around her small body. But as he started to pull away, Sarah's eyes widened with panic, and her small hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve with surprising strength. "Don't leave," she whispered, and the terror in her voice was raw, primal. "Please don't leave me alone." Jacob's throat tightened. He looked at this child, this frightened little girl who'd spent days alone with her mother's body, waiting for help that nearly didn't come, and he couldn't walk away. "I'll be right downstairs," he said gently, trying to ease her fear without making promises he might not be able to keep. "You can call if you need me. I'll hear you." "Please." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and her grip on his sleeve tightened. "I don't want to be alone. It's dark when you're alone." The words hit him like a fist to the gut. Jacob looked at the terrified child, then at the wooden chair in the corner. With a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his chest, he pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "I'll stay until you fall asleep," he said, his voice rough. "That's all I can promise for now, all right?" Sarah nodded, her eyes already growing heavy now that she knew she wasn't alone. "Thank you," she whispered. And those two small words carried a weight of gratitude that made Jacob's eyes burn. It took less than 5 minutes. Sarah's eyes drifted closed, her breathing evening out into the deep, even rhythm of exhausted sleep. Jacob sat watching her, this tiny stranger who'd somehow become his responsibility. In the flickering lamplight, she looked even younger, her face still marked with the tracks of dried tears. He hadn't been able to wash away completely. He should move, go downstairs, tend to his horse, get his own rest. He had chores in the morning, a life that didn't include a traumatized child who needed more than he knew how to give. But he found himself unable to leave. His hand rested near hers on the blanket, close enough that she could feel his presence if she woke, close enough that he could feel her breathing, could know she was alive and safe. And Jacob Thornhill, who hadn't cried in 10 years, who'd forced himself to be hard as stone to survive, felt something crack open inside him as he watched this sleeping child. A part of himself he'd thought was dead forever stirred, painful and unfamiliar, like a frozen limb coming back to life. He stayed in that chair all night long, keeping watch over a little girl who'd lost everything, and wondered what in God's name he was going to do now. The first week passed in a blur of uncertainty and discovery. Jacob quickly realized that caring for a 4-year-old was nothing like he remembered from his brief time as a father to Emma. Sarah barely spoke, communicating mostly in nods and shakes of her head. She ate little, picking at the food he prepared, her appetite stolen by grief. She spent hours staring out the window with empty eyes, watching the mountains like she was waiting for something that would never come. At night, she woke screaming for her mother. Jacob would climb the ladder to the loft to find her tangled in the blankets, sobbing with a desperation that tore at his heart. "Shh, I've got you," he'd murmur, sitting on the edge of the bed. Sometimes she'd let him hold her, her small body shaking with grief while he rocked her gently. Other times she'd curl away from him, lost in her sorrow, unreachable in her pain. During the days, she followed him everywhere like a silent shadow. If he went to the barn to tend the horse, she was right behind him. If he chopped wood, she sat on the porch, steps watching. If he stepped out of sight for even a moment, she'd panic, her breathing quick and shallow until he reappeared. Jacob tried to be patient. He remembered what grief felt like, how it consumed everything else, how it made the world grey and empty. But he felt hopelessly inadequate for this task. He was a man who understood horses and cattle, who could fix a broken fence or build a barn, not a man who knew how to fix a broken heart. On the 8th day, he made a decision. He needed help, needed supplies, needed things for Sarah that his bachelor homestead simply didn't have. He saddled his mare and lifted Sarah up in front of him. "We're going to the trading post," he explained as they rode. "It's about 15 miles from here. We need supplies, things for you, clothes and food you can eat. We'll be back before dark, I promise." Sarah sat rigid with tension in front of him, her small hands gripping the saddle horn so tight her knuckles turned white. Jacob kept up a steady stream of quiet talk, pointing out landmarks, telling her about the country they rode through, anything to distract her from her fear. The trading post was a rough building at a crossroads, serving the scattered homesteaders and ranchers in the area. When Jacob pushed open the door with Sarah in his arms, the proprietor's wife, Martha Jenkins, looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes took in the small girl and filled with immediate sympathy. "Lord have mercy," Martha breathed. "Jacob Thornhill, is that a child you've got there?" "This is Sarah May," Jacob said, his voice gruff with discomfort. He wasn't used to explaining himself to anyone. "Found her in a ravine off the mountain trail. Her mother had passed. Cholera, looked like." Martha's weathered face softened with compassion. She came around the counter, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. "Poor lamb, poor little lamb. Come here, sweetheart." But Sarah pressed closer to Jacob, hiding, her face in his shoulder. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't comment on it. "What do you need?" she asked instead. "Everything," Jacob admitted. "Clothes, proper food for a child, whatever you think she needs." Over the next hour, Martha gathered items while Jacob stood awkwardly holding Sarah, who refused to be set down. 2 simple dresses in soft cotton, 1 in blue calico and 1 in green. Warm stockings, a proper wool coat sized for a small child, undergarments, a nightgown with tiny flowers embroidered on the collar, a hairbrush with soft bristles, and from a shelf behind the counter, a rag doll with button eyes and yarn hair the color of honey. When Martha handed Sarah the doll, the child's expression flickered with something almost like interest before shutting down again, but her small fingers curled around the toy with careful possession, holding it against her chest. "She needs a woman's care," Martha said quietly to Jacob, when Sarah's attention was on the doll. "A child that age, without her mother. It's not right, not proper, for a man alone to be raising her." Jacob's jaw tightened, and he felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him. "She needs someone who won't give up on her," he said, his voice hard. "I'm not saying you would," Martha replied, keeping her voice gentle. "I'm just saying there's families in the valley who'd take her in, good Christian folk who'd give her a proper home with a mother and father both." "She has a home." The words came out fiercer than Jacob intended, surprising himself as much as Martha. "With me." Martha studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeing more than Jacob was comfortable with. "All right then," she said finally, "but you come to me if you need help. A child's not something you can just figure out on your own." Jacob nodded stiffly and paid for the supplies. Martha added a few extra things to the pile without charging him. A primer book for teaching letters, slate, and chalk, a small wooden horse painted brown and white, and a jar of honey. "For tea," she said when Jacob raised an eyebrow at the honey. "Children like things sweet when they're feeling poorly." On the ride back, Sarah held the doll against her chest with one hand and examined the wooden horse with the other. She still didn't speak, but Jacob felt her lean back against him with a fraction less tension than before. That night, for the first time since he'd found her, Sarah ate a full bowl of the stew Jacob had made with the fresh vegetables Martha had added to his supplies. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress, like maybe she was starting to believe she might survive this. The second week brought the first snow of the season. Jacob woke to find Sarah standing at the window of the loft, watching the white flakes fall with wide, solemn eyes. "Have you seen snow before?" he asked, climbing up to stand beside her. She nodded slowly, not taking her eyes from the window. "When Papa died, the ground was white and cold. Mama said the angels were crying because Papa was such a good man." Jacob's chest tightened at the image. "Snow isn't always sad," he said carefully. "Sometimes it's beautiful." Sometimes it's like a new beginning, covering up everything old and making the world clean and new again. Sarah looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face with an intensity that was unnerving in someone so young. Can it cover up sad things too? Sometimes, Jacob said honestly, for a little while. She turned back to the window, her small hand pressing against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. "I miss my mama," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the grief she'd been carrying alone. "I know you do, sweetheart," Jacob said, the endearment coming easier now. "And that's all right. You can miss her as much as you need to. Missing her means you loved her, and love is a good thing, even when it hurts. Do you miss your mama?" Jacob paused, choosing his words carefully. "I miss my daughter," he said quietly. "She was just a little older than you when she went to heaven, and I miss her mother, my wife, every single day." Sarah looked at him with sudden understanding, a wisdom beyond her years shining in those hazel eyes. "Is that why you're sad all the time?" The question pierced him. "Yes," he admitted. "Are you going to go to heaven too, and leave me alone like they did?" The raw fear in her voice hit Jacob like a physical blow. He knelt down quickly so he was at her eye level, his hands gentle on her small shoulders. "No, Sarah May," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes so she could see the truth of his words. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stay right here with you. That's a promise, and I don't break my promises." She studied his face for a long moment, those serious eyes searching for any sign of falsehood. Then, slowly, tentatively, she reached out and touched his weathered cheek with one small finger, tracing the deep lines there. "You have lines here," she said softly, "like Mama did when she was worried about me." "That's because I am worried about you," Jacob said, his throat tight. "I worry about whether you're eating enough, sleeping enough, whether you're warm enough, whether you'll ever smile again. That's a lot to worry about. Why do you care?" The question was simple, innocent, but it cut to the heart of everything. Jacob thought about how to answer. "Because you deserve to be cared for," he said finally, "because everyone needs someone to worry about them, to make sure they're all right. And because I think maybe, just maybe, we can help each other." For the first time since he'd found her, Sarah's lips curved into the tiniest smile. It disappeared almost immediately, like a bird taking flight, but it had been there, real and precious. Something shifted in Jacob's chest, a wall he'd built crumbling just a little more. As winter deepened and snow piled up outside the cabin, a routine slowly developed between them, fragile but growing stronger each day. Jacob would wake early, careful not to disturb Sarah, and climb down from the loft to stoke the fire and start breakfast. He'd gotten better at making things a child could eat: oatmeal with honey and dried fruit, eggs scrambled soft, toast with butter and jam. Sarah would wake to the smell of cooking and climb carefully down the ladder, the rag doll Martha had given her clutched in her arms. She'd named the doll Rosie, and she carried it everywhere, talking to it in whispers Jacob couldn't quite hear. After breakfast, Jacob would work on indoor tasks, repairing tools, mending harnesses, oiling leather, all the winter work that kept a homestead running. Sarah would sit nearby, playing quietly with her toys or looking at the picture books Martha had included in their supplies. In the afternoons, Jacob started teaching her letters using the slate and chalk. Sarah proved to be surprisingly quick and curious, her small brow furrowing in concentration as she copied the shapes he drew. "That's an A," Jacob would say, guiding her small hand with his larger, calloused one. "Like at the beginning of your name, Sarah. And in Jacob," she'd add quietly, one of the first voluntary comments she'd made, Jacob. "That's right, sweetheart. You're a smart girl." The praise would make her duck her head shyly, but Jacob could see the pleasure in her eyes. At night, after supper, he'd read to her, sometimes from the primer, sounding out words slowly, sometimes from the Bible, the old stories of Noah and Moses and Daniel. Sometimes he'd just make up stories, drawing on half-remembered tales from his own childhood, and Sarah would listen with wide eyes, occasionally asking questions that showed she was paying close attention. As the weeks passed, Sarah started sitting closer to him during these reading sessions, first on the same settee, but at the other end, then in the middle, then right next to him, her small shoulder pressed against his side, and then one night, without warning or preamble, She simply climbed into his lap and nestled against his chest like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jacob froze, his arms automatically coming around her small frame to keep her safe. She fit there perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her breath warm against his neck. He could feel her heartbeat, steady and strong now, so different from those first terrified, rabbit-fast beats when he'd found her. "You're warm," Sarah murmured sleepily, her words slightly slurred with drowsiness. "So are you," Jacob whispered, his throat so tight he could barely speak. "So are you, sweetheart." She was asleep within minutes, and Jacob sat there long after, afraid to move, afraid to disturb this precious moment, this child who'd somehow become his. This unexpected gift life had given him when he'd long since given up hope for anything good. He felt something crack open inside him, something he'd sealed shut 10 years ago when he'd buried his family. It hurt, this feeling, like blood flowing back into a limb that had gone numb. But it was also beautiful, terrifying, and right in a way he couldn't explain. The nightmares still came, though less frequently now. Jacob would wake to Sarah's screams and climb the ladder to find her thrashing in the blankets, calling for her mother with heartbreaking desperation. "I'm here," he'd murmur, gathering her into his arms, holding her close and safe. "I've got you, sweetheart. You're safe. I won't let anything hurt you. I want my mama." She'd sob into his shoulder, her small body shaking with grief that came in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. "I know you do. I know. Why did she leave me?" The question would come out broken, confused, a child trying to make sense of the senseless. The question destroyed him every time, made his own eyes burn. With tears he refused to shed. "She didn't want to, Sarah May," he'd say, his voice rough with emotion. "She didn't want to leave you at all. Sometimes people go to heaven even when they don't want to, even when they love us more than anything in the world. But she's still with you. Still watching over you, I promise you that." "How do you know?" "Because I know that's what mothers do. They never stop loving their children, no matter where they are. My wife, Emma's mother, she watches over me too. I can feel it sometimes." "Does it make you sad?" "Sometimes," Jacob admitted. "But sometimes it makes me grateful, because I got to know her and love her, even if I couldn't keep her forever." Sarah would eventually cry herself into exhaustion, and Jacob would stay, holding her until morning, his own eyes burning with unshed tears for all the losses both of them had suffered, for his wife and daughter, gone 10 years but still aching in his heart, for Sarah's mother, dying alone, except for a frightened child, for Sarah's father, whoever he'd been, for all the ways life could break your heart. One particularly bad night in late December, Sarah woke screaming and wouldn't be consoled. It was worse than usual, more intense, like all the grief she'd been holding in was finally breaking free. Jacob tried everything he could think of. He held her and rocked her. He sang her the lullabies he remembered from Emma's infancy, his rough voice stumbling over melodies he'd forgotten he knew. He talked to her about her mother, about good memories, about how love never really died. Nothing worked. Sarah was lost in her grief, unreachable, drowning in sorrow. Finally, Jacob did the only thing he could think of. He climbed fully into the bed with her, boots and all, and gathered her small body against his larger frame. He wrapped his arms around her and simply held her, lending her his strength, his warmth, his presence. "Listen to my heartbeat," he whispered against her hair. "Just listen to it. You hear that? That's the sound of someone who's not going anywhere. You're not alone, Sarah May. You'll never be alone again. I promise you. I'm not going anywhere. Not ever." He kept repeating it, a mantra, a vow. And slowly, gradually, her sobs began to quiet. Her small fist uncurled from where it had been clutching her nightgown and grabbed his shirt instead, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself unstable. Her breathing evened out, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. The shaking subsided, and finally, she slipped into sleep, still holding on to him. "Don't leave," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Never," Jacob promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Never, sweetheart. I'm yours now, and you're mine, and that's how it's going to be." He woke at dawn to find Sarah still curled against him, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time in weeks. His arm had gone completely numb from her weight, pins and needles shooting through it, but he didn't move, didn't want to disturb this moment of peace she'd found. as the weak winter sun filtered through the loft window, turning the snow outside into diamonds. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at him with those hazel eyes that had haunted him from the first moment he'd seen them, and for the first time since he'd found her, there was no fear in them, no panic, just trust, pure and simple and terrifying in its completeness. "Morning," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying but calm. "Morning, sweetheart. You stayed the whole night. I told you I would." She studied his face for a long moment, her small hand reaching up to touch his jaw, rough with stubble. "Can I call you Papa?" Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The word hit him like a fist to the chest, bringing back memories of Emma's sweet voice, calling him that very name, Papa. The last time he'd heard it, his daughter had been burning with fever, delirious, calling for him, even as the life slipped from her body. For a moment, the pain was so sharp, so overwhelming, that he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The word opened up a wound he'd thought had scarred over, made him bleed all over again. But then he looked at Sarah, this brave, broken little girl who'd lost everything and was trying so hard to build something new, to create a family from the ruins of her old life. And he realized that maybe, just maybe, second chances came in unexpected forms. Maybe healing didn't mean forgetting or moving on, but rather opening your heart again, despite the risk. Despite the fear. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide, "then yes, you can call me Papa." A smile broke across her face, small but genuine, the most beautiful thing he'd seen in 10 years. "Papa," she said, testing the word, making it hers. "Papa!" Jacob wrapped his arms around her. This unexpected gift life had given him, this second daughter who'd come to him in the most unlikely way. And he let the tears he'd been holding back for weeks, for years, finally fall. They weren't just tears of grief anymore. They were tears of gratitude, of hope, of second chances neither of them had expected to receive. They were tears of healing. "I love you, Sarah May," he whispered into her hair. "I love you so much." "I love you too, Papa," she whispered back, and Jacob's heart, that broken thing in his chest, began to beat in a new rhythm, one that included this child, this family of two. As spring approached, and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown grass and the first brave shoots of green, Sarah transformed before Jacob's eyes. The silent, hollow-eyed child who'd clung to her mother's body became a bright, curious girl who filled the cabin with questions and occasionally with laughter. She followed Jacob everywhere, not with the desperate fear of being left alone anymore, but with genuine interest in what he was doing. She wanted to know about everything. "Why is the sky blue, Papa? Why do chickens lay eggs instead of having baby chickens like the horses do? Can I help feed the horses? I'll be very careful. When will the flowers come back? Will there be yellow ones like Mama liked?" Jacob answered as best he could, finding that he enjoyed her curiosity, enjoyed seeing the world through her eyes. He taught her to gather eggs from the hen house he'd built in early spring, showed her how to be gentle with the horses, how to recognize different bird calls, how to find the first spring flowers blooming in the meadow. She was fearless with the animals, gentle with the chickens, despite their flapping wings, confident with the horses even, though they were so much bigger than she was. She had a natural way with living things, a tenderness that made Jacob's heart ache. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to him. Sarah sitting on his lap while he read to her in the evenings, her small hand slipping into his calloused one when they walked to the creek to fetch water. The way she'd look up at him with complete trust and say, "I love you, Papa," like it was the most natural thing in the world. The first time she'd said it, Jacob had to turn away so she wouldn't see his tears. No one had said those words to him in 10 years. He'd forgotten how much they could mean, how much healing they could bring. "I love you too, Sarah May," he'd whispered, his voice breaking, "more than you'll ever know." One warm afternoon, in April, Jacob was working in the garden he'd started behind the cabin, turning over soil that had been frozen all winter, when he heard Sarah's excited shout from near the creek. "Papa! Papa! Come quick!" The urgency in her voice sent him running, his heart pounding with fear. Visions of accidents and injuries flooding his mind. But when he reached the creek, Sarah was standing on the bank, pointing at something in the water with pure delight on her face. "Look," she cried, "baby ducks. Oh, Papa, look at them." Relief flooded through him so strongly it left him weak. There, swimming in the shallow water near the bank, were a mother duck and 6 tiny, fluffy ducklings paddling after her in a perfect line. Sarah turned to him with shining eyes, her whole face lit up with joy. "Aren't they beautiful? Aren't they just the most beautiful things you've ever seen?" "They are indeed," Jacob agreed, kneeling beside her so they could watch together. "The mama's taking care of her babies," Sarah said softly, her voice thoughtful. "Showing them how to swim and find food, like you take care of me and teach me things." Jacob's throat tightened with emotion. "That's right, sweetheart." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes serious, despite the joy still lingering in them. "My other mama is in heaven with the angels, but you're my papa now. That means we're a real family, doesn't it?" "Yes," Jacob said, his voice rough. "We're a family, Sarah May. You and me. That's what we are." Sarah threw her arms around his neck with such force she nearly knocked him over into the creek. Jacob held her tight, this little girl who'd brought him back to life, and silently thanked God for the day he'd ridden down into that ravine instead of past it. As summer arrived in full force, bringing long days and warm nights, Jacob realized he had a problem he needed to address. He couldn't keep Sarah isolated on the mountain forever, as much as part of him wanted to. She needed other children to play with, needed proper schooling, needed experiences and opportunities he couldn't provide alone in the wilderness. But the thought of taking her to the settlement, of exposing her to people who might judge her or him, who might try to take her away, filled him with anxiety. She was his daughter now in every way that mattered. What if someone decided a rough cowboy living alone wasn't fit to raise a little girl? What if they tried to place her with some other family? The solution came from an unexpected source. One morning in June, Jacob heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He stepped onto the porch with his rifle, then relaxed when he recognized Martha Jenkins from the trading post. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, on the wagon seat, was a younger woman Jacob didn't recognize. "Morning, Jacob," Martha called out cheerfully. "This is my daughter Elizabeth. She's been wanting to meet your little Sarah." Elizabeth was a woman of perhaps 28, with a kind face and sad eyes that suggested she'd known her own share of sorrow. She climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease and gave Jacob a small smile. "Ma told me about the child you took in," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "I'm recently widowed myself, and Ma thought maybe I could be of help, if you're amenable, of course." Before Jacob could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway, curious about the visitors. She stayed close to Jacob, her hand gripping his pant leg, but she watched Elizabeth with interest. Elizabeth knelt down slowly, making herself less threatening. "Hello there," she said warmly. "You must be Sarah. What a pretty name. I'm Elizabeth. I like your dress very much." Sarah looked down at the blue calico dress, one of the ones Martha had provided months ago. "Papa bought it for me," she said quietly. "Did he now? Well, he has excellent taste." Elizabeth smiled. "Would you like to see what I brought you?" She produced a small wrapped package from her bag. Sarah looked up at Jacob for permission, and he nodded. Slowly, Sarah approached and took the package, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a small book of fairy tales with color illustrations. "My mother used to read these to me," Elizabeth said softly. "I thought you might enjoy them." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Thank you," she whispered, then surprised everyone by giving Elizabeth a quick, shy hug. Over the next few hours, Jacob watched from a distance as Elizabeth worked her magic. Within an hour, Sarah was wearing a properly fitted dress Elizabeth had brought. Her hair was neatly braided with ribbons, and she was giggling as Elizabeth taught her a clapping game. Jacob felt both grateful and oddly jealous. Sarah needed this, needed a woman's influence and guidance, but seeing her bond so easily with someone else awakened old fears of being left behind, of not being enough. "You've done well with her," Elizabeth said later, when Sarah was napping on the settee, exhausted from all the excitement. "Really well, Mr. Thornhill. She's a sweet, bright child." "Jacob," he corrected, then added honestly, "and I've done my best, but I know it's not enough. She needs more than I can give her." Elizabeth studied him with sharp, knowing eyes. "She needs love and safety and someone who won't abandon her," she said firmly. "Seems to me you're giving her all of that and more. But the other things, the woman things, teaching her to sew and cook and behave like a proper young lady, I don't know how to do any of that." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "If you'd like, I could help with that. I could visit once a week, maybe Saturdays, help with her clothes." Teach her things her mother would have taught her. My own house is lonely since my husband passed. It would be good for me too, to have someone to care for. Relief flooded through Jacob. I'd be grateful, he said honestly. More grateful than I can say. And so, a new routine developed. Every Saturday, Elizabeth would arrive at the cabin with some new lesson or treat for Sarah. She taught her to sew basic stitches, to braid her own hair, to bake bread and make simple meals. She brought books and games and stories of the wider world. Sarah adored her, calling her Miss Elizabeth with the same affection she showed Jacob. But Jacob noticed something else too. The way Elizabeth looked at him sometimes, with a warmth that went beyond simple friendship. The way she'd touch his arm when she spoke to him, let her fingers linger just a moment too long. The way her smile brightened when he entered the room. How her eyes followed him when she thought he wasn't looking. He wasn't ready for that. Might never be ready. His heart had room for Sarah now. Yes, but romantic. Love felt like something from another life. Something he'd lost the capacity for. Catherine had been his wife, his partner, his great love. The idea of trying to replace her felt wrong, disloyal somehow. And besides, his life was full enough now. Sarah filled his days with purpose and his heart with love. It was enough, more than enough. One evening, after Elizabeth had left, and Sarah was asleep, Jacob sat on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about the last 10 months, about how drastically his life had changed. He'd gone from a drifter with nothing to lose, nothing to live for, to a father with everything to protect. Sarah had saved him, he realized, not the other way around, despite what people might think. She'd given him purpose, had reminded him that life could still hold joy and meaning and moments of pure beauty. She'd taken his broken, frozen heart and slowly, patiently, with her simple trust and growing affection, helped him piece it back together. He heard the soft pad of bare feet on wood and turned to find Sarah on the porch, her ragdoll Rosie clutched in one hand, looking small in her white nightgown. "Can't sleep, sweetheart." She shook her head and climbed into his lap without asking, fitting herself against his chest with the ease of long practice. "I had a dream," she said quietly. Jacob tensed, waiting for the nightmare, for the tears, but Sarah's voice was calm, thoughtful. "I dreamed about my other mama," she continued, "the one who went to heaven." "What happened in the dream?" Jacob asked. "Listen carefully. She was sitting in a pretty garden with flowers everywhere, yellow ones like she used to like, and she was smiling, Papa. She looked so happy." Sarah paused, then added softly, "She told me she was glad I had you to take care of me. She said you have a good heart, and that she'd been worried about me being alone, but now she doesn't have to worry anymore." Jacob's eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. "What did you say to her?" "I told her I love you very much, and that you're the best papa in the whole world." Sarah looked up at him with those trusting hazel eyes. "That's okay, isn't it? To love you and still love her?" "Miss Elizabeth said it was, but I wanted to make sure." "Oh, sweetheart." Jacob hugged her tight, burying his face in her hair. "That's more than okay. That's exactly right. Love doesn't run out. You can love as many people as your heart can hold. Does your heart have room for me and your other little girl who went to heaven?" "My heart has all the room in the world for both of you," Jacob whispered fiercely. "And for your mama too, who loved you so much, she fought to keep you safe as long as she could." Sarah nestled closer, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "We're lucky, aren't we, Papa? We found each other when we both needed someone." Jacob looked out at the mountains, dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky, and thought about that September day when he'd found a little girl clinging to her mother's body in a ravine. If he'd ridden a different trail, if he'd been an hour later or an hour earlier, if he'd convinced himself to leave her with someone else and ride away, his life would be so much emptier, so much darker, so much less. "Yes, we are, Sarah May," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The luckiest people in the whole world." The years passed, measured not in months or seasons, but in the small milestones of a child's growth. Sarah lost her first tooth and was delighted when Jacob told her about the tooth fairy. She learned to read, sounding out words with fierce concentration that reminded him of her mother's determination. She grew taller, stronger, more confident. She could ride a horse almost as well as Jacob could by the time she was 6. She helped in the garden, gathering vegetables with pride. She learned to collect eggs without scaring the chickens, to recognize animal tracks, to predict the weather by watching the sky. Elizabeth continued to visit every Saturday, and her friendship became something Jacob valued, even if he couldn't give her what she might have wanted. She taught Sarah the fine points of being a young lady, the things a motherless girl needed to know, but she also accepted, with quiet grace, that Jacob's heart wasn't available for courting. On Sarah's 7th birthday, Jacob rode to the trading post and came back with a present that made her squeal with pure, unbridled delight. A puppy, a black and white border collie with intelligent eyes and boundless energy. "Papa! Oh, Papa, he's perfect!" Sarah hugged the wiggling puppy with such joy that Jacob's heart felt too full for his chest. "He's the best present I've ever had. What are you going to name him?" Sarah thought for only a moment before answering with certainty. "Hope, because that's what you gave me when you found me in the ravine. Hope that everything would be okay again someday." Jacob had to turn away quickly, that old habit of hiding his tears that he'd never quite broken. But Sarah had learned to read him better than anyone ever had. "It's okay to cry when you're happy, Papa," she said, slipping her small hand into his larger one. "Miss Elizabeth told me that, and I think it's true. You cry because you love me, and that's beautiful." He looked down at his daughter, this miracle who'd come into his life on the worst day of hers, and he smiled through the tears. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. You're wise beyond your years." That night, after Sarah was asleep with the puppy curled at her feet, both of them exhausted from playing all day, Jacob sat at his desk and did something he'd been thinking about for months. He took out paper and pen and wrote a careful letter to the territorial judge, formally petitioning to adopt Sarah May Harper as his legal daughter. He described finding her, caring for her, the life they'd built together. He got letters of reference from Martha Jenkins and Elizabeth, from the minister who'd visited the homestead once to meet Sarah, from neighbors who'd seen them together and could attest to the bond between them. The papers came back 6 weeks later, official and binding. Sarah May Harper was now Sarah May Thornhill, legally and forever. When he showed her the documents, explaining what they meant in words she could understand, Sarah stared at them with wide, wondering eyes. "This means you're really truly my papa. Forever and ever. No one can take me away. Forever and ever," Jacob confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's how it's going to be until I'm old and grey." "You're already grey, Papa," Sarah pointed out with the blunt honesty of childhood, and Jacob laughed, a sound that had become more common in his life. "Fair enough. Then until I'm even older and greyer." Sarah launched herself into his arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. "I'm going to be a Thornhill like you, Sarah May Thornhill. Can I tell Miss Elizabeth and the puppy? Hope needs to know we're a real family now." "You can tell anyone you want, sweetheart." She pulled back to look at him, her face suddenly serious. "Will you tell me about Emma someday? Your other daughter?" Jacob's breath caught. She'd never asked before, though she'd known about Emma's existence for years. "Would you like that?" "Yes, because she's kind of like my sister in a way. We both belong to you, and I think I'd like to know about her, if it wouldn't make you too sad." Jacob pulled her close again, marveling at the wisdom and compassion in such a young heart. "It would make me sad," he admitted, "but it would also make me happy to share her with you. She would have loved you so much, Sarah May, just like I do." "Then someday when you're ready, will you tell me?" "I will. I promise." 5 years after he'd found her clinging to her mother's body in that ravine, Jacob stood in the cabin doorway watching Sarah play with Hope in the yard. She was 9 now, all long legs and bright laughter, her brown hair gleaming in the summer sunlight. She'd grown so much, changed so much, become so confident and joyful. Yet there were still moments when he saw that frightened 4-year-old in her eyes, usually on the anniversary of her mother's death or when something triggered a memory. But those moments came less and less often. Mostly Sarah was happy, well-adjusted, loved. Elizabeth had married a widower from the next valley over, a good man who treated her well. She had a baby on the way and glowed with happiness. She still visited sometimes, bringing news from the settlements and gifts for Sarah, and the friendship between all of them was comfortable and genuine. Jacob had never remarried, never even seriously considered it. Some nights, lying alone in the loft, he felt the loneliness of sleeping alone, of having no partner to share the burdens and joys of raising a child, but mostly he felt content. Sarah filled his days with purpose and his heart with love. It was enough, more than enough. "Papa," Sarah called out, her voice bright with excitement. "Watch this! I taught Hope to jump through the hoop. Come see!" Jacob smiled, leaning against the doorframe, and took a moment to just appreciate the scene before him. His daughter, healthy and happy. His dog, well-trained and loyal. His land, productive and peaceful. His life, full in ways he'd never expected it could be again. "Show me." "Sweetheart," he called back. He watched as she put the dog through his paces, her voice bright with encouragement, her movements confident and sure. This was his daughter, the child he hadn't known he needed, the second chance he hadn't thought he deserved. Sometimes he still thought about that September day, about how close he'd come to just riding past the ravine, convincing himself it wasn't his problem, that someone else would find them, about how easily he could have taken her to the settlement and left her with strangers, telling himself it was for the best. Thank God he hadn't. Sarah ran over to him, flushed with success and exertion. "Did you see? He did it perfectly. He's so smart, Papa." "He did indeed." Jacob pulled her close, dropping a kiss on top of her head. And teacher is pretty smart too. "I learned from the best," she said, grinning up at him with a smile that lit up her whole face. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple, Jacob stood with his daughter and his dog, looking out over the land he'd built a life on. It wasn't the life he'd planned all those years ago when he'd married Catherine. It wasn't the life he'd lost when fever took his wife and first daughter. It was something different. Something he'd never expected, something that had come from tragedy and loss, and the simple choice to do the right thing when it would have been easier to do nothing. It was better, because on an autumn day 5 years ago, a lone cowboy had found a little girl clinging to her mother's body in a ravine, and instead of riding away, instead of taking the easy path and leaving her for someone else to deal with, he'd made a choice that changed everything. He'd chosen love over loneliness, hope over despair, family over isolation, responsibility over escape. And in return, that little girl had given him back his life, had taken his broken, frozen heart and warmed it back to life with her trust, her love, her simple presence, had shown him that healing was possible, that second chances existed, that love could bloom again even in the hardest, most barren soil. Sarah looked up at him, her hazel eyes warm with affection and contentment. "Papa, are you happy?" Jacob smiled, his weathered face crinkling with genuine joy, with the kind of peace he'd thought he'd never feel again. "Happier than I have any right to be, sweetheart. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again." "Good," she said simply, slipping her hand into his and leaning against his side. "Because I'm happy too. The happiest girl in the whole Montana Territory. Maybe in the whole world. Then we're a perfect match, you and I." They stood together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, father and daughter, bound not by blood, but by something far stronger, by the choice to love when everything seemed lost, by the courage to begin again when all seemed ended, by the miracle of two broken hearts finding each other and healing together, piece by piece, day by day. "I love you, Papa," Sarah whispered, her voice soft but certain. Jacob squeezed her hand gently, his voice thick with all the emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I love you too, Sarah May Thornhill, more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the grass on these mountains, more than life itself, forever and ever, forever and ever." That's a promise. And as the Montana night settled soft and quiet around them, bringing with it the scent of pine and earth and growing things, Jacob Thornhill, the lone cowboy who'd lost everything and found everything again in the arms of a frightened child, finally, truly, completely came home.